detected manipulation. Both our improved versions improved this behavior, and especially the version that had the step-by-step guidance reported far more often than in the other groups. Now, to conclude and a little bit about future work, we conclude that the usability improvements and especially the step-by-step guidance helped the voters in detecting verification prevention manipulations, so that manipulation that is harder to detect because you need to have an understanding of the procedure, or you need to have a guide which tells you, okay, this is the procedure, is this how it looks like online as well? And it also helped for reporting both types of manipulations. Then, detecting isn't the same as reporting, even though related work often implicitly assumes that all detected manipulations are also reported, or at least they do not specifically examine if they are reported or not. But our results show that it's very important to distinguish, because only manipulations that are also reported can be acted upon by the election officials. Here you can see on the left-hand side always the number for people that detected the manipulation, and then the versus on the right-hand side is the number of people that also reported the manipulation. Lastly, for future work, we want to look at the reporting process a little bit more in detail. So a question that we ask ourselves is, so if there's an attacker that is powerful enough to change a vote, change a ballot, they would probably also try to suppress any report. So we want to look in future work how voters would react in such a scenario where they are unable to report on the first try. With that, thank you all for your attention, and if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you so much. We might have time for one quick question. Yeah. So before you talk about the future work, I was curious about what if the report is also being like modified by the attacker. But I was wondering, so far, do you have any kind of potential solutions about this question?
Yes, we do. We actually already started a study. So I mentioned before that cast and audit is one approach to reach individual verifiability, or cast as intended. There are other ones, and these other ones, they rely on pre-distributed data that the voter receives through a secure channel. So for example, a return code that is sent to the voter via postal mail, and they have to check if the online system gives them the same return code again, because the online system does not know these, or the device doesn't know these codes. So if the device can provide this code, the voter has some sort of proof that, okay, the system is acting honestly. For the report, we implement the same idea. So additionally to the description of the report, the voters need to provide a code which signals to the reporting system that indeed this is a valid report itself. And then the reporting system sends back another code that the voter then checks with their sheet that they receive via mail. And if this is the same, if it's equal, then the voter has a proof, okay, my report was captured. And if not, they need to choose another way of reporting.
Great, thank you. That's very interesting. Best wishes to your study.
Thank you.
Let's thank the speaker again. So our next speaker is Hanno Hagge from University of Southern Denmark. Hanno will present the Cybersecurity Anxiety Scale, a new instrument that helps researchers better understand users' concerns, threats, and perceived control in cybersecurity contexts. So Hanno, the stage is yours.
Yes, thank you. My name is Hanno Hagge, and I want to talk to you about the Cybersecurity Anxiety Scale. We live in a very digital world. Much of our communication and our free time is spent online, and through this we get in contact with security mechanisms and cybersecurity. Though everybody has different levels of knowledge towards these mechanisms and systems, so there are differences in how you react. And there's differences in how well a user's mental model, that is their internal understanding of threats, safeguards, and consequences, align with the system's design. And if there's a big difference between it, it could lead to emotions, to negative emotions like stress, worry, and the feeling of lack of control. So it could be, or it should be a goal to design systems which target which have design that is anxiety aware to address these emotional barriers. What is cybersecurity anxiety? We defined it as a feeling of nervousness, worry, and tension stemming from potential cyber attacks and how we react to these incoming threats. So often it could be the feeling of helplessness or perceived inability. A degree of anxiety is okay if you don't worry at all about incoming threats and don't take any security measures. That is not good. But if you stress about it all the time, that's not good either. So one of the goals of this study was to identify flawed mental models and enable the design of cybersecurity anxiety-aware design systems. And how this was addressed was the creation of the cybersecurity anxiety scale. It was created in a three-step process, where the first step was an initial candidate item generation where we created 204 candidate items from forum analysis, cognitive interviews, and examining relevant literature. These items were rated on a 5-point type Likert scale. The second step was the scale development, where over 3 survey rounds, analysis was performed. In general, a standard process for psychometric scale creation was followed. So throughout these surveys, an analysis was performed to preserve desirable psychometric qualities like factor structure, model fit, and Cronbach's alpha. The third step was to evaluate the scale. Here we used confirmatory factor analysis to confirm our previous analysis and finalize a concise 15-item scale. These 3 factors, the analysis resulted in 3 factors, from which the first one is the present factor, which captures fears and concerns related to immediate or ongoing cybersecurity threats that could occur in the present moment. The second factor is the future factor, which concerns about anticipated and potential cybersecurity risk emerging from technological change. The third factor is control, which represents proactive and preventive measures taken to mitigate cybersecurity risks. Then we get to the psychometric properties of the scale. This is important because it tells about which quality the scale has. First is the reliability measure, which shows us whether the scale provides the same result every time it's taken. Here we assess the Cronbach's alpha for both the entire scale, but also each of the 3 factors. And as you can see, all of them viewed a number above the threshold above 0.7. So there's good internal consistency in both the whole scale, but also the single factors. The next validation was examined. Validation looks at whether the construct of cybersecurity anxiety is actually measured. Here we looked at confirmatory factor analysis, whether it's looked at whether the identified factors in the analysis also holds in the end. And our analysis showed acceptable model fit here. Then we calculated correlation towards other scales. This is important because if you have good correlation towards a measure which is already validated, it also shows the quality of your scale. CybAS had significant correlation with cybersecurity attitudes and behavior intentions, though it had no association with generalized clinical anxiety. From the surveys we got from an US population sample, we looked at how we would score the scale, and based off the sample, we divided it into three stages: low anxiety, average anxiety, and high anxiety. And we looked at the median, and then went one standard deviation from the center to make our intervals. We have a picture here showing it off. If you have low anxiety, you should overall boost the awareness. You're probably not aware of that there is some dangers in the cyberspace. If you have average anxiety, you should probably boost your motivation and ability to act. And on the high anxiety level, you should probably clarify your mental model. CybAS can be used to contextualize observed user behaviors by understanding the emotions tied to the underlying mental models that produce them. Through our analysis, we found out that it is both possible to use the entire scale, CybAS, or the single factors. This is possible because the high Cronbach alpha value for both the entire scale, but also each of the factors. Yes, and a high score in the present factor shows that the participant is probably overwhelmed by security tasks. A high value in the future factor means that the participant probably is anticipating some severe threats in the future. And control shows that, high control shows that the participant is probably afraid to lose valuable data. Here we have a picture about hypothesized mental categories based on the CybAS subscales in combinations. Here the y-axis has both the present factor on the left side and the future factor on the right side. This is because they both focus on concerns, one about concerns in the current, which could happen currently, and some which could happen in the future. So both of if you have high score in present and future, but low in factor control and control factor, then you would probably be very afraid, but you don't know how to handle it. Then, if you are here, you have much control, but you probably don't know why you would implement it because you're not aware of, or not concerned enough. Then, besides this, you can use. We saw that there's no correlation towards clinical anxiety, so we proposed that you don't need therapy about it to fix cybersecurity anxiety, but you improve it through interactional designs, system feedback, and targeted training. Besides this, you can use the CybAS in A/B test, where you maybe could have a UI with more explanation and one with less, and then assess how cybersecurity differs between them. And you can also use it to measure how interventions change cybersecurity anxiety level. Yes, so here are the key takeaways from this presentation. We created the cybersecurity anxiety scale, which is validated and reliable. It connects mental model to security system design, and we provided benchmarks for scoring, and this is usable as both a total scale and a single factor scale. Yes, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you for bringing this wonderful scale to us. We have questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. Really looking forward to playing around with the scale a bit. I'm wondering if you have any sense of, in terms of demos that you've done, if the scale that you've developed correlates to other kinds of scales that are out there and present. And in particular, I'm thinking of Weston's privacy scale, which does categorization of individuals into like privacy fundamentalists, privacy pragmatists, and privacy unconcerned. And so how much of, and what I'm trying to get at too with this question is how much of these categories that you're identifying are intrinsic to the individual and how much of it is something that we can actually help get people educated, into a particular direction.
Could you repeat the last part?
Sure. So it's kind of two questions. So the first is there correlation with other sort of scales that are out there? And the second is, do you think that the scoring indicates something that's intrinsic to the individual in terms of their disposition, or is it something that people can be educated to be less anxious about?
Yeah, so for the first question, we calculated the correlation towards, I believe, 8 different scales, but not the one you mentioned. In our future work section in the paper, we described that it would be a good idea to calculate correlation towards other scales as well. The one you mentioned sounds very relevant for the field. So in future work, it could be a good idea to do so. We unfortunately did not do it in this iteration. And for the second question, I'm a little bit unsure on that one.
I have a comment. I would just say we did discuss this, and we do not think this is an intrinsic trait. We think it's a state that is changeable with variation.
Yeah, I think.
But it has not been tested. We would love to see people test that and let us know.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Always love to see scale development work at CHI. My question is, because my background is in psychology, and I wondered about your items because they don't, in my very first quick overview, they don't really match theoretical work on anxiety in psychology. So I was wondering if you have like a theoretical background, for example, like Beck's theory on anxiety, that's more like on dysfunctional negative thoughts, etc., etc. So I was wondering whether you like theoretically matched it to the terminology of anxiety that is used in psychology, or whether you would differentiate it from psychological use of the word of anxiety.
Yeah, so as I said, we tried to calculate correlation towards generalized anxiety, and we also examined in our literature review a bunch of different anxiety scales. Though our correlation, there was not huge correlation, or no significant correlation towards clinical anxiety. So I forgot to say that, but we think that cybersecurity anxiety is more a domain-specific anxiety, and not like the classical anxiety you would think about.
But you didn't think about then differentiating the terms, because that could confuse people using anxiety, but it's not measuring anxiety. So a bit of like a jingle-jangle issue. Do you have did you discuss other words that we would use for this scale, or would you still stick to anxiety?
I think, that's a good question. I think we would still stick with it because I think it describes well what happens, but I can see your point that it may be confusing for some.
Okay, thank you.
But if you, we are, the whole research team is here, so if you want to discuss it further, you're welcome.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Unfortunately, we have to close the discussion here. If you have any questions, please continue the conversation with Hanno afterward. So our next speaker is Marian Harbach from Google. Marian will speak about how users identify the source of interface elements in modern interfaces and why this matters for security and privacy. Marian, please go ahead when you're ready.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being here today. I want to start by asking a question that seems incredibly simple, but actually cuts to the core of how we design secure systems. When a user interacts with their device and the software contained on it, do they actually know who they're talking to? Do they know who's responsible for the particular piece of UI that they are about to click on? And Hanno also talked about this just now, that it gets to these mental models that people have of how a system works. So today I'm going to talk about this fundamental, yet often completely overlooked problem in modern user interfaces. We call this concept surface attribution. And I co-authored this paper with my awesome colleague Jessica Johnson, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. And the title of the paper is Who Am I Talking To? And that is exactly the dilemma that users face every single day when they navigate the web or use an app on their laptop or smartphone. So it's a problem of invisible boundaries, blended trust, and thus ultimately confusing user experiences. Take a look at this illustration of what is potentially on a screen when someone is using a computer. As HCI researchers, creators, engineers, we know exactly what is happening here underneath the hood. We know that the operating system is drawing the status bar at the very top and the taskbar at the very bottom. We know that the browser is rendering the address bar above the web page content. We know that the web developer is choosing which parts of the web page goes where and that it needs to ask for location access. And in the worst case, the web page is even embedding content from yet another web developer in an iframe. And finally, we know that the browser or the operating system is rendering a permission prompt that overlays it on top of everything else. But to the average user in the end, this is just one single flat piece of glass. They're interacting with a complex composite of surfaces that are drawn by different actors, each of which has varying levels of trust, varying security properties. So for example, when a user enters their password or when they grant location or camera access, they desperately need to know who they are actually giving that data to and where they might go to change their mind later. Ideally, users have a useful mental model of who shows what and therefore can easily understand who is asking a question and who receives the respective data in the end. If this fundamental understanding is flawed, we believe users will have more problems keeping themselves and their data safe while using these modern software systems. We formalize this ability to understand what's happening on the screen as surface attribution, as I mentioned before. It is defined as the user's capacity to correctly identify the source or the responsible entity of a specific region or UI element on the screen. Why does this matter? Because we want our users to be able to understand what's happening and also because security and privacy paradigms rely on it. For example, security guidance might tell users, only enter your password when you are sure it's the correct web page. Or we say, pay attention to security messages from your operating system. But if users cannot reliably distinguish a legitimate security or privacy decision UI from a fake pixel-perfect one drawn by a malicious website, those instructions are mostly useless. It stands to reason that users will struggle to make good privacy and security decisions when they struggle to understand who they are actually dealing with. So in many cases, there might be no immediate harm from a lack of understanding. Clicking accept on a fake permission prompt doesn't really grant an app access to your location. In other cases, however, this confusion enables a whole suite of concerning attacks, like phishing. In any case, as a community, we've never deeply measured to what extent users actually understand who's responsible for what they see in the different parts of the screen, so that's what we set out to do. Here's another example. Historically, the security community has relied on spatial cues to help users with the attribution problem. This is maybe the most famous example with the concept of the line of death in web browsers that you might have heard of. The idea is incredibly simple. Anything above a certain pixel line is drawn by a trusted browser, and anything below that is untrusted, potentially malicious web content. Consequently, as long as trusted UI, like a password prompt or a permission dialog, overlaps that line, the user should be able to implicitly trust it. But modern critiques argue that this is simply too subtle for the real world, and I think we can all agree. If we ask ourselves, do average users actually know about this line? Do they notice when a prompt is 2 pixels below it instead of overlapping it? We decided it was time to rigorously test this assumption, even though we might already know the answer. So to address the challenge, we focused on 3 research questions. First, what's the baseline? How well can users attribute surfaces in the wild right now? Second, which specific factors like branding, familiarity, or UI positioning influence this ability? And third, we can proactively improve attribution, or can we actually proactively improve attribution by adding some form of explicit branding to security critical prompts? To tackle the research questions, we conducted 2 large-scale vignette-based online surveys with a US Census representative sample. In study 1, we tested over 2,300 desktop users and 2,000 mobile users with static screenshots of real-world surfaces. We highlighted specific elements with a red dotted box and simply asked them, to the best of your knowledge, who is responsible for what you see in the highlighted area. We tested 36 different surfaces, ranging from operating system level file pickers to FedCM login flows and Chrome's password manager. Study 2 then focused on mobile OS permission prompts, collecting a baseline of surface attribution across platforms and multiple measures of attribution before adding branding as an additional explanation to check how easily incorrect attribution might be remedied. Here are the results, and the baseline results from study 1 are frankly quite sobering. Across the 36 different real-world surfaces we tested, participants chose the correct responsible entity only in 55% of cases on desktop and 53% of times on mobile. Think about the implications of that. For nearly half of the UIs people might interact with, they fundamentally misunderstood who was providing that UI or asking for the sensitive data. To give you some concrete examples, when shown the OS level file picker that was triggered by clicking a button on a website, a staggering 58% of users mistakenly attributed the file picker dialog to the website itself rather than the operating system. They might thus believe the website can already see the files they have on their computer. Or when shown a so-called chip UI that is entirely contained inside Chrome address bar, that is also clearly a position above the line of death, only 49% correctly attributed that to Chrome. We believe these hint at significant widespread misunderstandings of who is responsible for which parts of the UI. To further understand what drives these numbers, we ran a generalized linear mixed effects model to isolate which factors actually help users to get it right. Our analysis revealed that familiarity is one primary driver. Users who reported being highly familiar with the surface were roughly twice as likely to attribute it correctly. Strong visual cues, like the presence of a Google or Chrome logo, or distinct brand illustrations, also quite drastically improved accuracy, sometimes up to 6 times higher for mobile when compared to unbranded prompts. However, our findings also directly and empirically challenge the line of death concept. The spatial positioning of permission prompts in particular, whether they overlap the trusted browser area or were solidly centered in the untrusted website content, had minimal and frankly inconsistent impact on correct attribution. So spatial cues are simply not enough to help users understand what's going on. Alongside these findings, our second studies then focused specifically on Android permission prompts, and we wanted to see if adding an explicit security and privacy branding, specifically a shield icon and a clear title, would help users realize that the operating system was asking for the permission and not the app. We recruited over 1,000 Android users and tested a control group, a branded group, and a branded group with an additional explanatory text, as you can see in these 3 screenshots here. The results were quite disappointing. For both non-Samsung standard Android users as well as Samsung users, the branding made absolutely no difference. They correctly attributed the prompt to the OS about 55 and 63% of the time across all conditions. This suggests that merely slapping a shield icon on a UI does not fix a broken mental model, especially if the branding that's being used isn't quite yet familiar to people. Study 2 revealed also a critically important nuance. We realized that asking who drew this specific box might be quite a bit abstract, so we also asked action-oriented questions, such as, if you selected an option and then wanted to change your selection later, where would you go? And we found that users were significantly better at answering the action-based question, knowing to open their Android system settings to revoke a permission, even if they couldn't correctly articulate that Android was fundamentally responsible for drawing the initial prompt. On the more abstract attribute question, we received 53 to 64% of correct answers across conditions, while 64 to 75% of respondents were able to correctly answer the action-based question. This strongly suggests that surface attribution is a multifaceted concept, and users might lack the technical vocabulary or the explicit architectural mental model of UI rendering, but through repeated daily use, they may learn the practical consequences of their actions and the potential remedies that are available to them. Still, the gap in understanding of the underlying system architecture leaves them uniquely vulnerable to wrong assumptions. So what are the actual implications for the HCI and usable security privacy community here? The overarching takeaway I want to leave you with is relying on users to distinguish trusted UI from untrusted UI based on subtle visual heuristics is a fragile and easily failing security paradigm. The line of death is functionally dead in the minds of average users, and adding a shield icon to a prompt doesn't magically repair a user's mental model. While consistent branding, long-term user education, And building familiarity can certainly help, especially branding cues are no silver bullets and can be trivially spoofed by a motivated attacker as well. As a research and engineering community, we need to stop burdening our users with complex decision UIs and subtle security indicators that demand that they are constantly vigilant about their own safety. And instead, we must continue moving towards more robust system-level security that protects users by default, regardless of whether they know who exactly is drawing the pixels on the screen. Thank you very much for your time and your attention today. The full paper explores additional surfaces, more statistical nuances, which you can read by scanning the QR code here on the screen. And thank you, and I'd like to open the floor for any questions.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cori Faklaris from UNC Charlotte. I love this paper. It hints at something that's, I think, a bigger problem, which is I'm seeing young people come to our university and they've grown up with computing that's so abstracted that they may not even know what a file tree is, for instance. But I'm also wondering, do you think that there ever was a time where this was different? Or do you think that we always just kind of assumed people knew this line of death, and actually that's just been something that's never been part of people's mental models?
Yeah, I would think it's the latter, even though we don't know, right? I think in the beginning, there might have been a bigger chance for some people to have a better understanding just because how they learn technology and technology growing and you sort of, building these blocks on top of each other in your own experience, whereas now you come in and you get the pane of glass in your hand and you start interacting with that from the outset. But there was never a motivation for regular people, like thinking of my parents, for example, to actually understand the nuances of what contributes to the composite that you see on the screen.
And then a follow-up then, yeah, I think I'm kind of thinking you're right. But I like the idea, of course, of unburdening users, moving things to the back, making it invisible. Do you think there are still instances, though, where at least in a submenu, it would be desirable to have these settings still exposed for people to tinker with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need both, right? We need to do the best that we can for people who don't care, but there are also enough people out there who do care and who do want some knobs and who do want some control, and we need to cater to all of them. So we need the best of both worlds, I agree. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Mingyi Liu, who is a PhD student at Georgia Tech. And Mingyi will share how the FTX incident shaped users' trust in crypto wallets. Great. Mingyi, the stage is yours.
Hello everyone, I'm Mingyi, a PhD student from Georgia Tech. Today I'm going to present our work on a user study in centralized crypto exchanges titled, I just have faith in my wallet to not mismanage my crypto, investigating changes in user security perceptions post the FTX collapse. So crypto is a form of digital currency that enables direct transactions on the blockchain. It's rapidly becoming mainstream with a market worth over $2 trillion and increasing policy attention. So as you see here, so there have been proposals in the US White House to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve. But interestingly, despite the decentralized vision of the blockchain, much of this activity still relies on the centralized exchanges. So this creates a tension between the decentralization in design and centralization in use. So in order for the users to interact with these systems, users, they rely on the crypto wallets. And there are two main models. First one is the non-custodial wallets, where the users manage their own keys. And the other one is the custodial wallets, where the exchanges manage the assets on the user's behalf. However, centralized exchanges have not always been reliable. So over the years, there have been multiple major security incidents and failures, including the Mt. Gox and FTX that resulted in significant user losses. So for example, the FTX was one of the largest crypto exchanges in the world. But in 2022, it collapsed due to the misuse of customers' funds, which triggering a liquidity crisis where many users could not recover their assets. So this raises two key research questions for us. So first, how does the exposure to such large-scale centralized exchange breaches affect user security perceptions of CWs and NCWs? And second, so what kind of risk mitigation actions do users take based on their changed security perceptions? So in this work, we focus on the FTX incident, given its large scale and impact. So to answer the questions, we conducted a semi-structured interview followed by a large-scale online survey for validation. So in both studies, we invited the real-world FTX incident victims to participate. So first, the observations about the security perception changes were mostly in line with our expectations, that learning about the FTX collapse led to a general decline in crypto users' perceived security of the CWs, with a modest improvement in their perception of NCW security. And the primary reasons for the CW's negative change were their awareness that exchanges control their assets and the potential collapse risks, like one participant said here. So what if this happened tomorrow with my custodial wallets? And instead, users' recognition of their full control over the crypto was the main reason for an increased sense of security toward the NCWs. And regarding the second research question, so the changes in security perceptions did not translate into adequate risk mitigation, that the majority of users neither explored new wallet options nor transferred their crypto assets to safer wallets. So we also looked at why some users chose not to move their crypto after the incident. So the most common reason was quite practical. So many participants, they said they didn't have much crypto, so they didn't think it was worth moving. And the second reason was more interesting. So some users said they trusted their non-custodial wallets. However, we found that a number of them had actually misclassified their wallets, so which means they were using custodial wallets but believed that they were non-custodial. So this means they continue to face the risks while mistakenly believing they had full control over their assets. The third reason here was that users trusted their custodial wallets, but more than half of these users were actually using unregulated custodial wallets. So yet they still had strong trust in them. Like the user said, I just have faith in them, right? Next, we look at users who actually moved their assets after the incident. So we analyzed the crypto flows as shown in this figure. Here, the yellow nodes represent the CWs, the custodial wallets, And the blue note here represents the non-custodial wallet. The key observation you can see here is that the most transfers were not to NCWs, but rather withdrawals from CWs to traditional banks. So in other words, instead of moving toward the self-custody, which means moving to the NCWs, right? So many users exit the crypto ecosystem altogether. Finally, we identified the several concerning user patterns and proposed mitigation strategies. First, as mentioned earlier, so most users, they did not take action after the incident. We therefore recommend that the exchanges provide clear and action-oriented instructions, such as withdraw your funds as soon as possible before presenting some detailed explanations. So we imagine these instructions being delivered through alert emails or directly shown to those affected users when they log into the platform. And we also found that many users have incorrect mental models about wallet custody. So only 44% of the survey participants, they correctly identified the type of wallets they had used. And in addition, so only 35 of them were aware that in the CWs, which means in the custodial wallets, private keys are actually held by the exchanges. So it's quite a low number, right? So to address this, we recommend introducing the mandatory custody verification during the wallet onboarding. For example, interfaces could require the users to actively confirm who controls their keys, such as choosing between exchange controls keys and I control keys before proceeding to the next step. We also found that users' understanding of the incident may be closely linked to their perception changes. Participants with more negative views of non-custodial wallets were less likely to correctly understand the causes of the FTX collapse. So this suggests that the incident misinterpretation may amplify the negative perceptions of the non-custodial wallets. So we, to mitigate this, we recommend that we recommend a more structured and user-friendly incident reporting, so including clear timelines and a plain language explanation and some actionable guidance. So that's all of my talk, and I'm happy to take questions now. Yeah.
Thank you very much. If you don't have questions, I suggest that we move on to the next presentation as our time is off. Okay?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
So let's welcome our next speaker, Hanso Lee. And Hanso is a research assistant professor at KAIST. And Hanso will share findings on how users understood and responded to the 2025 SIM breach in South Korea. And Hanso, whenever you're ready.
Good morning, I'm Hanso Lee from KAIST, South Korea. Today I'll talk about how people understand or actually misunderstand SIM-based security. So through our work, Mind the SIM, because most of us use SIM like every day but really don't think about it. So we all kind of know what a SIM card is. Oh, it's not working. Yeah, so we all kind of know. I'm sorry, but this isn't working. center view. But, let me see. Like I want to check this. Like whenever I try to, this isn't working. Let me just, yeah. Like I want to progress to the next screen and it's not like working here. It's not working.
But I don't know how it works.
Is that because your mirror is screen?
When I put on change, we put on put mirror.
No, I like to extend display, but it worked when I tested. Yeah. Yeah, it's not working.
But it's working here.
Yeah.
And put this one on.
Yeah, you can screen.
But the thing is that I cannot read my script.
Get it here, the same.
No. It's not working. No, I mean like I have to do the like I need to watch the script here and it should be extended here and it worked before that, but it's not working, not right now.
Extend.
Not working.
Would you mind restart your laptop?
I'm sorry.
Would you mind restart your laptop? It's like
And display. So the thing is that I like to read and move on, but
You are
yeah, I
showing
can.
here.
Yeah,
Put this one here and the other.
like this one.
Yeah, this one is changing the slides.
Is it working? Okay, sorry for the inconvenience. So let me start from where I left off. So we all kind of know what a SIM card is, right? So it's a small chip in your phone, but beyond that, it actually does three important things. So it represents your identity, it enables authentication like one-time password, and it connects your device to the network. So in many ways, your phone number becomes your digital identity, and that's where the problem starts. Okay. So this is really, okay, so because this tiny chip is actually connecting your identity, your device, and services like banking, so when we say phone number, we're literally talking about access to your phone, lots of accounts. And when the SIM is compromised, for example, the SIM swapping, someone else can receive your authentication codes. They're just not stealing your number, they're taking over your authentication layers. So in 2025, South Korea's largest telecom provider, SKT, was breached, and SIM authentication data, about 23 million, which is half the population of South Korea, was breached. While no immediate individual harm was directly reported, the breach involves SIM authentication data at the carrier infrastructure level. And this included SIM-related authentication data, such as IMSI, which is a unique subscriber identifier module, and the key, the secret used for network authentication. So rather than exposing personal profiles, it exposed the credentials used to verify your user identity. So because of this, we treat all SKT users as potentially affected, even though individual compromise cannot be verified. So in response, the carrier offered free SIM replacement and introduced additional security measures. So, but here's the interesting part. This was a very visible incident, and it was all over the news. But the system itself is invisible. So SIM operates in the background, and for most users, it's basically a black box. So the question was, do people actually understand what happened, and what are the potential consequences? So. So, and this brings us to the gap. Most prior work focuses on technical vulnerabilities, but what's missing is how users make some sense of this system. So now you might ask, like, people already kind of know what SIM is, but why do we need to study mental models in detail? So the issue is not whether people are aware of what SIM is, but how they think it works and operates. So because every small misunderstanding can lead to completely wrong assumptions about the risk and misconceptions around how to deal with the system. So we're not studying the knowledge, but we try to focus on the interpretation itself. All right, so we try to focus on three things: how users perceive the breach, how they respond, and how they mentally model SIM and authentication. Right. So to answer these questions, we conducted a qualitative study with 33 participants from both SKT and non-SKT users. So we used semi-structured interviews or drawing tests to elicit mental models and a post-session reflection. So we asked participants to draw how SIM works, and we used two scenarios: making a phone call and authentication like an OTP with a banking system. So we chose these two because they represent the two most common ways people interact with SIM in their everyday life. So we analyzed the data using thematic analysis and categorized mental models into low, mid, and high levels. So to give you a little bit more detailed information about our participants included both SKT and non-SKT users across ages from their 20s to 60s, and most participants did not have a technical background. So based on this background, we started, I'll go through the findings following our three research questions. So first, in terms of awareness, So users have very limited understanding of the breach. So most described it simply as a just hacking incident without knowing what was exposed. But they still perceived risk, mostly in terms of financial loss and identity theft. So they feel the risk, but actually didn't really understand the overall mechanism. And this is actually a very good representations of such patterns, and users associate SIM compromise with losing money or identity, but they do not actually understand what SIM actually does. And this is especially shaped by the Korean context, where phone numbers are tightly linked to banking and identity verification. So risks are interpreted through familiar outcomes rather than through an understanding of the underlying system. So more importantly, this perceived risk did not lead to a higher intention of learning or what SIM is about, or acting a little more vigilant in terms of mobile security. So users show such patterns due to their learned helplessness, trust in telecom providers since they're big tech companies, and a delusional belief that such accident will not likely to occur to them, or perceived value of their data or limited understanding. So even when they recognize the risk, they often show low concerns, which is quite contradictory. All right, so based on that, we moved on to user responses. Okay. So we also observed mixed trust toward the telecom providers. Some users expressed low trust, questioning whether the solution was sufficient, and others showed high trust, especially when they saw visible actions like SIM replacement provided by the big tech companies. But regardless of mixed trust level, personal relevance remained low, which is kind of interesting. And interestingly, we did not observe any strong differences between affected and non-affected users. So even affected users often showed a detached response, thinking they can't be the one who the hackers are specifically targeting. And non-affected users show mixed responses, sometimes redirecting concern to others, like family members who were actually part of the affected users. So overall, the incident was not strongly internalized. So in terms of participants' behavior responses to the incident, so we asked if they actually complied to the measures that were actually offered by the telecom providers. And in terms of behavior, most users follow the carrier's guidance. But the interesting thing to note is that despite the severity of the risk, only 9 participants out of 17 affected participants fully complied, some partially complied, and some did nothing. And self-initiated actions were very rare. So these kind of patterns were primarily driven by the cost, effort, convenience that users perceived, and also fatigue and indifference of switching, having to switch the mobile carrier, having to go to the company to actually change their SIM carrier. So users did not really act proactively, but they sort of acted more like a reactive sense. So let's move on to the mental model, which is a very important part of this study. Okay. So prior to delving into the very details of the mental models of SIM security, we asked participants to actually define SIM card in a very general sense and how they would like to define SIM card with the knowledge they have. And users generally knew that SIM was very important, but did not actually understand how it works. But some had a very moderate understanding, and some had a very low understanding, and only a few have very accurate model representations in their head. So awareness exists, but we found that understanding of how SIM security worked was very shallow. Okay. And the call, so when we asked participants to actually draw how SIM card functions in each primary scenario of SIM card interaction, in the call process, we observed different levels of mental models. So high-level users included very detailed description of how SIM card works during the telecommunication. So they included network components, and mid-level users focused on signal flow, and low-level users had totally incorrect or abstract ideas. And this shows a large variations in understanding. So this example shows how participants actually visualize the system and the overall interaction. So some drawings, as you can see, they're very structured, while others are very abstract. So the funny thing to look at is if you take a look at the figure C, it was coming from our participants in his 70s with no reported technical knowledge, who genuinely believed that his SIM card was somewhat physically installed in his ear so that everyone could telecommunicate with everyone else. So this kind of highlights how users conceptualize SIM card differently according to the how complete their mental models are. Okay, and for authentication, we saw similar patterns. Some users correctly describe the interaction between the bank carrier and SIM card, but many believe authentication is handled entirely by the bank or even independent of the SIM. So the role of SIM was often misunderstood across different demographics of the participants. All right. And these drawings again show the diversity of mental models. So even when users understand part of the system, they often fail to connect them in a very detailed way. So after we asked participants to actually work on the mental drawing session, we offered participants a short video on SIM functionality, since generally most of the participants lacked basic knowledge. So after the video, they reported they learned something new about SIM, and they realized it plays an important role in authentication and data flow and overall data privacy in general. But importantly, this rarely led to intention to actually change their behavior in terms of being more vigilant around mobile security and being more protective of their personal data. So here we see a clear gap between understanding and action, which is a long-standing viewpoint in privacy and security research domain. So putting everything together, we see a kind of paradox. Users rely heavily on phone-based authentication, but their understanding of SIM remains low. And importantly, we did not observe strong differences between the affected and non-affected parties. Instead, users' responses were shaped more by their mental models than their actual exposure experience and the overall knowledge they have. So moving on to the discussion, so based on our findings, we derived several design implications to better support users' understanding of SIM-based security. So there are several things. First, focus on specific knowledge gaps and real-world relevance for education, rather than providing broad or very generic explanations, because users really don't have time for that. And second, users use everyday scenarios such as banking, message, or OTP to help users connect security risks to some familiar context. So users had a very vague idea of what SIM security is about, but when they were actually confronted with the real-world examples, they were better to actually identify the potential risk and potential outcomes that are about to come. And third, support reflective framing and just-in-time nudges, so users can recognize security-relevant moments during actual interaction. And fourth, consider cultural and social context adaptation, especially in environments like Korea, where phone numbers are tightly linked to identity and lots of services that are highly dependent on personal data. So together, these approaches help bridge the gap between users' understanding and their security behavior. And we also discovered that, a key challenge underlying these findings is that SIM operates as an invisible structure. So users do not see when the authentication happens or how the identity is verified. As a result, they rely on very surface cues, for example, whether their phone is working, to infer that everything is secure. So this kind of creates a mismatch between the actual system behavior and users' mental models. And this is exactly why simply providing more information is not sufficient. So instead, we need designs that make critical moments perceptible and interpretable to users, which motivates the implications we just discussed. So this is a takeaway message for the study. So overall, participants had a very limited understanding of SIM security, even though it's very directly related to their daily practices. And based on our mental models, we found that rather than direct exposure experience itself alone, participants were highly influenced by the overall mental models. and prior experiences with the SIM security incidents. So based on that, we found that making invisible security perceptible to the necessary moments is very important. And this is a very important phenomenon that we discovered throughout the security outreach. And I was very sorry for the inconvenience, but as time went by, I got the hang of it. But thank you, and this is it. Thank you.
Apologize for the inconvenience caused, but that was a great talk. Thank you. We have to move to the next presentation. And the last speaker of this session is Magdalena from RC Trust, TU Dortmund. Magdalena will talk about how AI certifications affect users' trust and reliance, and how these effects compare with the actual reliability of the system.
Hi everyone, thanks for sticking around. Last presentation of this session. Yes, Magdalena Wisniewski from the Research Center of Trustworthy Data Science and Security. Less privacy, more trust now. I don't know you, AI is everywhere. It's the second day of Kai and I feel already tired of hearing AI, but it is everywhere, and calls for AI regulation increase. In fact, we have many prominent regulative frameworks that have partly been in action and going into actions. So a lot of work is happening on how to regulate AI. And we were looking at one specific AI regulation. Tyler gave it away. So this is a screenshot from the EU AI Act that calls for certificates. So AI systems, especially in high-risk contexts, should be or shall be certified. How? We don't know. But we asked the question, if that ever happens, what happens when these systems are certified? What happens when users interact with certified AI systems? And we have some empirical data on that. Some studies have been conducted, and spoiler alert, in the next session I'm going to talk again about AI certificates. So if you're interested in this topic, please come to room 121 in the next session. But the empirical evidence that we have so far is very mixed. So the green studies that we have here, they all found positive effects on trust, particularly. And in our own work, we always found it didn't really matter, or we found null results. But the problem that we saw with these studies, at least the first three, all these studies are vignette studies. So people didn't actually interact with the system, and we were like, maybe that's a good idea to start. Have people actually interact with something, and then see maybe we find a difference in the behavior, not in the self-reports. And that was one of the first research questions that guided our work. How do AI certifications shape perceptions, in this case trust, of the system before and after an interaction? But we didn't want to stop there. We were also interested in how the behavior of the system shapes this, particularly. And we were interested in mistakes, because systems are not perfect. There will always be some mistakes. And we were wondering what happens when a certified system makes a mistake. We did a pre-registration for our hypothesis. They're very long and extensive. Please look into the paper. Not going to go into detail here. So we did an online experiment. We varied two different factors. We varied if people saw a certification or didn't. And we varied the reliability of the system. It was either very reliable or less reliable. And it was still a good reliability. I think it was around, good depending on that's a very normative thing. So it was just lower. We just needed to somehow introduce mistakes, so that's the low reliability condition. It was 644 participants from the US in this case. No, from Germany, sorry, from Germany. What am I saying? And the task was a two-step visual estimation task. So you can see the stimulus material here. So people had to guess how much of the in the picture, how much of the material is infected by a bacteria in percent. So it's rather difficult, which is also something that is a limitation of the study, because this is something that people perform okay with by themselves, so they actually do need AI support. And I think that would be something that's interesting to vary here. So first, people had to do this, they had to do their own guess and say it might be 7%, and then we introduced them to quantify AI, and the Wizard of scenario, they didn't interact with an actual AI, but we made them believe so, hopefully, that the system was giving another idea of what, or their own estimation, its own estimation. We did 10 runs of this, and then wanted to estimate what happened. For that, we measured trust in and vigilance toward Quantify AI with the scale that we developed and just got accepted last week. We also measured the behavior here, so the reliance, how people relied on this. And we had to reviewer 3, the appropriateness of the reliance as well. So in the original, only pre-registered reliance, so this is how much the system influenced the people, but we also then added the appropriateness of that reliance, where they actually, should they follow the AI advice or not, because sometimes the system was wrong. We also measured expectancy violation with an indirect and a direct measure. I'm not going to focus on that. So results, what happened here? Before the interaction, so people were introduced to the system, and some people were told it's certified or not. And we saw that before they even ever interacted with the system, we kind of found what we were hoping for, that people trusted it more if it's certified. And people showed more vigilance if it wasn't certified, which is, yeah, pretty straightforward what we would hope for and expect. However, after the interaction with the system, this effect vanished. So we didn't find any difference for trust or for vigilance. So it seemed that the certification didn't matter as much as did the actual system behavior. We did find, though, that reliance was still affected by the certification, so we found a main effect for certification on the reliance behavior, as well as the appropriateness of that reliance. So, which is super interesting. While people self-reported that the certification didn't have any effect after interacting, their behavior was still affected by the certification. It was a label in this case. Then we also looked at what happens now when the certified system makes a mistake. And I'm only going to report the interaction effect here. The main effects are in the paper. We did the main model. The model was significant for trust, but when we looked at the plain contrast, we didn't find any difference for the certification or uncertification. So even if the system was not reliable, the certification didn't have any effect on trust. Same was for vigilance, same was for reliance, but it was different for the appropriateness of reliance. So when people were interacting with a system that was less reliable, the certification helped them to accurately follow the system more. So imagine you're working with a system that is certified, and sometimes it makes a mistake. The certification helped the participants here to spot when the system was making a mistake. So going ahead to the implications, we think that it actually increased vigilance. But I'm jumping ahead here. Lastly, we looked at the expectations. We also did a mediation analysis, but I'm just going to report the interaction effects because it would be too much. So we indirectly measured how the expectations were affected, and we did find an interaction effect, not for the reliable system, but for the unreliable system, which is, I think, super interesting because we found people actually had more expectation violations for the unreliable system, which is how we interpreted it in a way that we think that if a system is certified, people kind of have a bit more glorified or an idea of the system that it can do more than it can. And if then the system makes a mistake, there's a stronger expectation violation. However, we only found that for an indirect measure and not for the direct measure. Our key takeaways from the study was that before interacting with the system, the certification raises trust and lowers vigilance towards the system, which is what we expect, maybe what we even hope for. However, after users interacted with the system, that effect vanished and was only measurable for reliance and appropriate reliance. So self-reports were unaffected by that. We did find some evidence, only the indirect measure, that certifications might have elevated users' expectations about the system performance, which is something that leads to how do we design such certifications that this does not happen, that users get the wrong idea about what a certification means and can do or not. We are super happy about very, very interesting results, and we want to go ahead with that. So we're planning to do more on psychological mechanisms of this II certification. So what happens to cognitive load, ease of use, familiarity with technology. Very important, what happens if a system is updated? Do we still find effects for certification? And what happens when certification actually becomes mandatory? Again, if you're interested in this, I point you to the next session. I'm going to talk more about this, about qualitative results that we have for this. This was only quantitative. Thank you for sticking along. It was a long session. Try to keep it short. If you have any questions, I'm here for you.
Thank you very much for the talk. And do you have questions? Then we have.
Hi, I'm Cori Faklaris from UNC Charlotte. It seemed like a lot of the critical results relied on this indirect measure. Can you give us more information about this measure?
Yes. We used the ability dimension of the trust scale that we measured. So we asked people before interacting what they think that system can do. And then we ask after they interacted, do you think the system actually did what you thought it would do? And then we calculated the difference.
What's the difference then between the indirect and the direct?
In the direct measure, we asked directly, like, do you think the system behaved differently than you thought it would be? Like, we actually asked the people. And so in the first time, we asked about just the ability of the system, and the second time we asked about the performance of the system.
What's the difference between ability and performance?
Oh, sorry, yeah. Okay, I'm struggling. English.
Yeah, I know, I'm sorry.
Can I come back to you and show you the items?
Yeah.
Would that help?
I can always look at the paper. I just thought if there was something quick that you can share, but it's no problem.
Well, so I think I would like to answer that directly with the items. I think that makes more sense before I just blah blah blah.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
Yeah. We can also sure.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Sorry, it's a very quick question, and it's very aligned with the previous one. So I'm interested to know which kind, if you use any standardized questionnaire or like just simple single-shot question. So what is trust for you? Because you mentioned trust before and after the interaction. So I'm just curious. I know I can read the paper, but if you have just a quick shot.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. We did use, so for trust and vigilance, we developed a scale that is validated and that hopefully will be published soon-ish. It got accepted last week. There's a preprint of that is out there. For reliance, we use the weight of advice. I think that's a rather common measure. It has its flaws, which we discuss in the paper. And then we included the appropriateness of that reliance to get a better understanding of that. Because that reliance in itself is not really, it's not too useful, which we realized afterwards. And then the expectancy violation, we used one of the dimension of the trust scale. That's also validated and will be hopefully published soon.
Thank you very much. We are reaching the end of this session. Thank you all for attending this session. If you have any questions for the speakers, please reach out to them, feel freely. And I wish you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.